Thank you very much. Thank you. Welcome. I'm Father Mitch Packer. Welcome to Threshold of Hope, where we take a look at the writings of the church. Before we get to it, I want to say that today is a really nice feast for us Jesuits. It's the feast of Our Lady of the Way, or also known in Italian, Madonna della Strada, which means Our Lady of the Way. And she is the patroness of the Society of Jesus. The original icon is now in the Church of the Gesù in Rome, where St. Ignatius is buried, his tomb is. And it shows the Blessed Mother and the child Jesus, very common of ancient icons. And the reason this is so important for us Jesuits is when St. Ignatius and the first founders went to Rome in, I think, 1538 or 39, the Pope gave them this very small chapel of Our Lady of the Way, as it was our first church. Later on, the church was demolished to build a larger church someplace else, so the icon was brought to the Gesù, which was made right around the same time. So it's a very important devotion for us, and of course, it's a good thing for any and all Christians to begin a journey when you're going in the car, and just a lot of people do this, just pray. Our Lady of the Way, pray for us. And for me, it's kind of extra special because it'll be 40 years next month. I was ordained a priest at Madonna della Strada Chapel at Loyola University. And frankly, the last president of the university, Father Garanzini, had beautified it tremendously. Oh, it's just so beautiful now. It needed some renewal, you know, but what he did, the new tabernacle, and all is just spectacular. So if you get a chance to go there, it's well worth paying our Lord a visit. And they have an icon of Our Lady of the Way there too. All right, we are continuing on with Veritatis Splendor. You can get a paperback copy by going to EWTN's religious catalog. That's EWTNRC.com. Or you can call them anytime, 1-800-854-6316. If you prefer, you can download a free electronic copy of Veritatis Splendor by going to the document library of our website, EWTN.com. Just go into document library. It's up at the top under faith. Hit document library, type in Veritatis Splendor, and you'll be able to download it into your computer for free and print it out if you wish. Of course, we'd love to have you get involved and participate in our show. You can do like these nice folks have come all the way as far as Puerto Rico and some other folks from up north in Ohio and Indiana, right here in beautiful Irondale, Alabama, and it is beautiful today. You know, the weather's been stunning. Or you can send a question by writing to threshold@EWTN.com, or call us during the live broadcast, which is Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you're listening right now, it's live. And the phone number in North America is 1-800-221-9460. Or if you're outside North America or inside Birmingham, you can call 205-271-2980. All right, we are continuing on a section, and we're getting to the next couple paragraphs are two of the most important of this encyclical, in which the title is The Object of the Deliberate Act. And he's going to define what that is, beginning in paragraph 77. Remember that he's been talking about certain theories of moral theology that are called teleological. In other words, they would say that your good intention and your goal is what makes something moral or not. Okay, that's what a teleological, because teleological means looking toward the purpose or the end. Telos is a Greek word for end. Teleology is the study of the end or purpose. And he says, when these theories give rational criteria for right moral decision, they take account of the intention and the consequences, all right, of various human actions. And there is need to do this. We need to pay attention to one's intention. What do you want to do? What are you trying to do? And the consequences, what will happen when you do that? As he says, that is part of responsibility, to think about what are you trying to do and what are the consequences. That takes thinking ahead. Okay? Jesus says that to the Pharisees when he is speaking, for instance, in Mark chapter 7, beginning with verse 20. Jesus said to the crowds, after criticizing the Pharisees, what comes out of a man is what defiles a man. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, fornication, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, pride, slander, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and they defile a man. So our Lord wants us to pay attention to what's inside your heart, what's going on from inside. But though it is important to note, he was saying that to people who were trying to obey God, but were focused on the external and not having the insides set right with God. That's what's key in that passage. And it's also good to pay attention to the goods that you obtain by your good intention and the evils you avoid. That's important. Like I say, responsibility demands it. And we want to teach people from the time they're as capable, as young as they're capable. We try to teach people, our children, how to be responsible and think ahead. Or at least my mother did. You know, you never think ahead, do you? A common refrain as I was growing up, and it seemed to get worse when I was a teenager. Or at least said more frequently, either one. However, the consideration of the consequences and the intentions is not sufficient. It's not enough to think about your intention. Oh, I want to do good things, and the consequences you're looking for. Because again, one of the reasons my mother would say, you never think ahead, do you? Is because a lot of times I intended to do something very interesting, presumably very cool, but inevitably very stupid. And by the way, I always leave it as a basic principle, drawing on my own life experience. The more teenage boys involved in a decision, the worse it usually is. Just saying. Now, it's not enough, it's not adequate to weigh the goods and evil that you can foresee as a consequence, because we'll see why in a minute. And whether that choice is according to the nature of the thing you're trying to do. That's one of the things. What is morally good or what is morally bad for the thing itself, or for the person, himself or herself. The foreseeable consequences are part of the circumstances of the act. So before you do an action, you try to foresee what's going to happen, what will be the result. But they haven't happened yet. And that's just what, again, he calls the circumstances. And those circumstances can make the seriousness of an action a little bit less. A person who, I didn't mean to break it. I didn't, but I told you not to throw the ball in the house. Mom, are you here still? But that'd be a common thing, you know. I meant to throw the ball back and forth, and I meant to catch it every time. That was my intention. But that foreseeable consequence did not always happen. And that does not make it less serious, because I was just trying to catch the ball. I didn't mean to knock over the lamp or the dishes, whatever. You know, that'd be a small issue, but common enough one. And so it's not quite as bad. But even though I didn't intend to break stuff when I was throwing the ball in the house, it still got broken. And that, my goal of catching the ball every time, that was my intention, that did not lessen or make less the evil of the act, because the lamp stayed broken, no matter what my intention might have been. I broke a rule of my mother, and I broke her lamp because of that. She could foresee that I wouldn't always catch the ball better than I could. And it's very important to realize that everybody can recognize it is difficult, if not impossible, to evaluate all the good and evil consequences. I couldn't even figure out that I might break the lamp by throwing the ball. That's a small act. And I couldn't figure out that the stuff might get broken. But think about big issues. Think about when people go to war. Our leaders take us into wars. They oftentimes have good intentions, but they cannot foresee all of the consequences. That was exactly why Pope St. John Paul had said to our president and to Saddam Hussein, don't go to war. You can't see all the consequences. And the consequences that occurred after it was basically deposed Saddam were horrendous for the Iraqi people, for a variety of reasons nobody foresaw. It's hard to see, if not impossible, to see that a group of Al-Qaeda is going to start doing terrorism and blowing people up in Baghdad, and then later on form ISIS. You can't see all that ahead. That's the difficulty. And it's not possible to exhaust by thinking rationally, well, this could happen, this could happen. Life is not that simple, that you can figure out the consequences of everything. And there are three married couples. I would dare to say, when they got engaged, they did not foresee all that would go on in their lives. Would I be off base on that? That you could foresee, oh yes, I'll marry him and I'll marry her, and we'll have our whole life mapped out, everything will go according to plan. Did that happen? Probably not. Probably not. So this is something that all of us have to pay attention to. And we go now to paragraph 78, where he gets at the nub of the issue of why this is a mistake. That he makes this point, and this is absolutely key. The morality of the human act depends primarily and fundamentally on the object of the act, rationally chosen by deliberate will, borne out by, as St. Thomas said. Now, he said this in the Summa Theologiae, in the Prima Secundae, question 18, and in answer 6, where he says, certain actions are called human in as much as they are voluntary. Now, in a voluntary action, there is a twofold action. Namely, the interior action of the will, that's one part, what you decide in your heart. And secondly, the external action, what you actually go ahead and do. And each of these actions, the internal decision and the external act, each of these actions has its object. What is it trying to accomplish? The end or purpose is properly the object of the interior act of the will, what you want to do in your heart. That's the object of the interior act. While the object of the external action is that on which the action is brought to bear. So what you actually get done is the object, okay? Now, this is very important to see that you have the internal desire or decision rationally and deliberately chosen, and you have the external action that you accomplish. Each has their own object. How do you grasp if the object of an act which specifies that act morally? Right? You have to be able to figure out how you know whether the goal or object is moral, morally good versus morally evil. You have to figure that out. This is one of the key issues. So it is necessary to put yourself in the perspective of the acting person. That is, someone who is a human being making a decision. You don't think like a computer, and you think that's not a problem. Some people want us to think that we are machines. It was popular, more so in the 60s and 70s, to talk about the human machine. There are even books like that. I think Herbert Marcuse gave a critique. He was a philosopher who talked about the human machine and stuff. And a number of other people talked like that. We're not machines, nor are we simply animals. We are animals, but we are rational animals. And again, you cannot take that for granted anymore, because we have so many people who think, look, you've got these instincts and you cannot thwart your instincts any more than an animal can. Some examples. There was a Dr. Kinsey who wrote a study on sexuality, 2 studies, one on male sexuality, one on female sexuality. And his model, as he himself states, Dr. Alfred Kinsey, the model is a fruit fly that he had studied for his doctorate. He had done a doctoral dissertation on the reproductive cycles of a fruit fly because they die and give birth so quickly. They could do multiple generations in a short time. They live for 3 days, the kind of moth, some sort of moth that he did. And that was his model. Says, look, humans are no different in their sex drives than our moth. And that model was picked up. As a matter of fact, it became, as explicitly stated by Hugh Hefner, that became the inspiration of Playboy magazine. Hefner wrote that in the first edition of Playboy. I didn't read that edition, by the way, or any other. Never read Playboy, not even for the articles. But I was doing a study on Alfred Kinsey and discovered that Hugh Hefner was inspired by this model. So we're not the animals, we're not machines, okay? We have the perspective of an acting person who has free will. So the object of the act of willing, when you make a decision inside of your heart, when you make that interior decision as an act of the will, that is a freely chosen kind of decision. You have free will, okay? And again, all the psychologists like B.F. Skinner denied that. You are, only what your environment makes you do. That was what Skinner taught. So just control the environment, you'll control behavior. So nope, we believe that in free will. And to the extent that the decision, what you do with your free will, to the extent that it conforms with the order of reason that because animals don't think ahead, they react by instinct. If they hear or see a movement, they freeze and turn their heads toward that sound. And then if they see that it's a source of danger, if they hear a sound, a rustling, then they see a coyote, then they'll run. Or I've seen does try to kick a coyote to death to defend their fawns. That's an instinct. You don't have kick the coyote classes for deer. They don't have that. They just act by their instinct. We make a decision. Do we need coyotes or not? Do we just shoot them or do we want them around? And this is something they have to do. So you use the order of reason to think through. It is, and that this causes the goodness of the will. When you think reasonably and use your brain to figure out what is good or not, that is what makes something good, morally good. And it perfects us morally. And when you start to think about what is right and wrong, rather than, well, everybody's doing this, society, this is one of my favorites. Society has changed, so morality has changed. Do we not hear that all the time? Especially from the fools who are running for office. How often do they cite that? Well, society's changed. I mean, remember Vice President Biden saying, of course we're in favor of homosexual marriage. We learned that from watching Will and Grace, a comedy series on TV. He said that on the Sunday news show on a May Sunday back in 2012 when he was running for re-election. We learned from Will and Grace, who, by the way, didn't get married. But I digress. Till I think the last episode or something. No, when you use your mind and your reason, then it perfects us morally, because using your mind to think through what is good disposes a person about the ultimate good of life. Why are we doing this? Or as there was a song that was late 60s, I think, is this all there is? Is that all there is? That was, some of us remember the 60s. Because you can get all the success and you can have all sorts of stuff, but what good is it? And as I remember one guy who told me he was very wealthy, had been a very great success, but he had a heart attack when he was 52, and for a variety of reasons, and he all of a sudden realized, what am I doing? And he realized he did not regret, I'm going to miss having another week in the office. That's not what he thought. He said, my kids don't even know me. I don't know my kids. What have I done for my wife? And that, made him reevaluate, what is the purpose of success? In other words, humans begin to think ahead of time. What is the goal? As I mentioned last week, I've been in life-threatening situations a number of times. And one of the times when I was in my 20s, I realized that this is not just about me. I need to make sure that if that the next time I came close to a dying moment, I needed to say an act of contrition and not some angry expletive. That wasn't going to do me any good. An act of contrition would, because it helped me to realize that my ultimate good is to be with God in heaven forever. And missing that is the end. That's catastrophe. So that thinking about what is good helps a person to see the ultimate goals of life, the ultimate purposes. And that is perfect good and the primordial love of God. The love that existed before the universe existed, before the Big Bang. God loved us infinitely. And this is the purpose of life. By the object of a given moral act, then one cannot mean a process or event just on the physical order. Just, we'll say, well, I want to change the structure of the world order so that there's democracy everywhere. You know, that doesn't work out in every place. You know, some cultures aren't ready for that. So you can't just change the physical order or be like B.F. Skinner. I'll change your environment, then I'll make you a good person. You know, that's not the way it's going to happen. And there's an effect of your environment, you know, on you for sure, but it's not going to make who you are. And nor can you assess moral behavior on making a change of state of affairs in the outside world just by politics. No matter whom we elect in the next presidential election, that won't change whether people are morally good or morally bad. The election of a president won't change whether or not people choose to get high on drugs, kill other people in order to get the drugs and make money doing it. That won't change it. It has to be another kind of change to change that moral behavior or lack of moral behavior. The object is the proximate or the close purpose, the close end of a deliberate decision that determines your act of making an act of the will as a person. So what the Catholic Catechism says in number 1761, there are concrete acts that are always wrong to choose because their choice entails a disorder of the will, that is, a moral evil. One may not do evil so that good may result from it. Well, I want a perfect society. That means I must kill all the Jews. That is inherently morally evil. You know, I don't want to bring a child into the world who might not have the best advantages. I want to bring in only children who are wanted. And if they're not wanted, I'll kill them. That is an inherently immoral act. And you can't ever justify an immoral act. Well, what about saving the mother? I hate the choice that maybe a mother has to make. I don't want moms to die in childbirth at all. But if I see, that would be a crazy situation, but if I see a bus hurtling in my direction and I say, oh, I'll push this guy next to me in front of the bus so I can get away, that would be an immoral act. I cannot kill somebody else in order to save my life. Can't. It's wrong. But I need a new kidney. I cannot go and kill somebody who might be a good match in order to steal their kidney or their heart or anything else. It's an inherently immoral act. That's why St. Thomas wrote in his book, In Duo Precepta Caritatis, in the 2 precepts of charity, it often happens that man acts with a good intention, but without spiritual gain because he lacks a good will. Let's say that someone robs in order to feed the poor. In this case, even though the intention is good, the uprightness of the will is lacking. That you steal in order to help the poor. Consequently, no evil done with a good intention can be excused. There are those who say, and why not do evil that good may become? Their condemnation is just. Romans chapter 3, verse 8. Let me give you a quick example of something going on right now that's been bothering me. I was talking before the show began. I saw somebody sent me on the internet, it was a picture of John F. Kennedy, May 1961. In 10 years, I will put a man on the moon. Then there's another picture of President Barack Obama. I will put a man in the women's bathroom. Now, that's sort of a joke and a political comment. But here's more the core of the difference. That President Kennedy I remember being inspired by that. I was 12 years old in 1961 and said, yes, let's do that. And he said in that context, let's make our schools better. Let's get our kids to study more math, more science. We want to learn so that we can get on the moon and think of all the other, so that he motivated us to study harder and put more effort into our schools. What does President Obama do? I want to put people of the opposite gender in everybody's bathroom and have boys in the girls' shower room and girls in the if they feel that that's what they are. And he says, and if you don't go along with me, I will take money out of the schools that the federal government is giving, and you won't get it until you do what I say. That's the opposite of inspiring us to reach out to be better. It's a threat. Look, I'm from Chicago. He only moved there from Hawaii. Or wherever else he came. I think he was living in Harvard before that. He had to learn from us this stuff. But I know how this works. If you don't go along, we'll take your money. That, you see, and we also would agree. I don't want people who are doing this transgender stuff to be oppressed, mocked, bullied, or anything. But I cannot upset the normal common sense of not putting teenagers in each other's showers, lockers, and bathrooms, because that's not good sense. And think about it a little bit, you'll see what I mean. I don't think he would want his daughters in the shower, common shower, with a couple of guys. And I don't blame him. He shouldn't. And while we want to protect these people who are going through this difficult transition, and I think an immoral one, but that's another issue we can get to. But you cannot then threaten to withhold tax money that is not his money anyway. It's our tax money. And that he would do this kind of threat is not only an evil in itself to make such threats, and it's against I'm sure it's against the law. I can't imagine there's a federal law allowing this. But he also is willing to cause other evils to prevent one good. That's not a good moral action. No matter what his intentions might be, it is not a moral action. And this is why I say we have to use our reason to think through these issues and understand the inherent good of the ultimate purpose of the human being. And he's not in this case. So these are how we use these things to start thinking today. We'll take a break, come back in a couple minutes and get your comments, your questions, and phone calls, so please stay with us. Thank you, and welcome back. And we're going to go right to calls. We have Joyce on the line. Hello, Joyce. Where are you from?
I'm from Weatherly, Pennsylvania. Father Mitch, how are you today?
I'm full of spit and vinegar.
I know, I can tell you're so much more vibrant and lively. I love you.
Well, you know, there's nothing like having a roto-rooter go through your big arteries here, the ADL. Matter of fact, it was cool because I was awake when they did that, and I could feel it right under my sternum. And then when they were going to pull it out, I said, "Oh, can I watch?" I thought that was cool.
I think it would be.
See, it was bad enough when I had Tinker toys. But so what's your question today?
I just want to tell I'm glad Mother Angelica didn't want you there right away, because we love watching on Tuesdays and Wednesdays.
Oh,
I was just wondering, I want to start reading the Bible. I got to St. Joseph's Version, because I didn't realize 20 years ago I read it was King James Version. And I got it from EWTN, by the way.
Yeah.
And I heard a couple of different things. Could I restart from the Gospels, or should you start from Genesis and go through?
Let me make a great suggestion to you. Do you remember Jeff Cavins? He has a program called the Bible Timeline. You can get it from EWTN Religious Catalog. And it shows you how to read, because the Bible, not all the Bible is written down in the exact historical order. So he puts it into what happened in sequence. That is one of the best ways, and it's got a book to help you with it, and I think even some CDs or DVDs that you can go along, and believe me, everybody I know who has gone through Jeff's Bible study timeline, it's called the Bible Timeline, they've all loved it, and that'll be the best way. And don't worry about how long it takes you. What you want to do, because it's not just getting through it, but it's also letting it help work inside your heart. So that's what I would do. Very, very strongly urge anybody to do that. I have a question from our studio. Sir, where are you from?
I'm from Dayton, Ohio.
Great to have you here.
Thank you. I have a question. It's troubling that the government wants to be so heavy-handed and so bullying about this transgender issue. Mm-hmm. I don't understand. If they're threatening with withholding money and funds and things like that, and dismantling proper education, then what's a way to fight back? What should we do?
Yeah, this is going to be a couple. You have to contact some of the lawyers and such. But I think a couple things. One, Congress has the authority over the funding of the government, not the president. And Congress has to step up to that threat. And this is why so many people, this whole election, in both parties, people are really angry with the parties. Why? Because none of them on either side are stepping up to get anything done. And people are sick and tired of it. And that's why they're voting for, people on the fringes so much. On both parties. And it's going on now, starting with Congress people too. And we have to talk to Congress people who will go along with the Constitution. And especially in the first articles about this is the role of the president and this is the role of the Congress, and you can't do our job. And one of the things that they may need to reconsider is, and this has to be thought out by people with more experience and knowledge than I have in regard to whether or not the federal government should get money from us and then send it back through the bureaucracy to the schools instead of keeping the money locally to get sent to the schools locally with a couple, not a couple steps of bureaucracy out of the way, a lot of bureaucracy. I mean, it's more like a bureaucracy sponge that takes, it really is like a sponge. A bunch of water comes in the top and a lot of it comes out, but there's a lot of the water that stays in the sponge of the bureaucracy. Do we need to reconsider this? Though with insurances, because a lot of this happened because sometimes often enough, the local government was not fair in distributing money to the schools that were poor. That was one of the reasons the federal government got involved in distributing money for the schools. But this is just as corrupt. Just because it's the president, what's the difference if you have a bunch of racists saying, we're not going to give money to the schools with their black children, we're going to keep it for the white people, because those people never learn. Well, what's the difference in the effect when it comes to saying, well, we're not going to give you the money that we give you for the poor schools until you do what I say? It's the same result. The poor schools are the ones that suffer, whether it's people who are racist doing it or whether it's the president doing it. It's wrong. And to try to get, by the principle of subsidiarity, as much local control, but again, guidance to make sure that doesn't become corrupt again and put the poor at a disadvantage. That's the goal we want to prevent. We want the poor to get as good an education as they possibly can. But we don't want this kind of evil manipulation by the president. And do you think that Mr. Trump he's saying we're going to get rid of all the gun-free zones and have everybody in the school have a gun? Wait a minute. That is not federal concern. Local concerns need to take care of local issues. And the president should not be telling the schools that somebody's got to have a gun in every school, or we're going to keep your money. Trump and Obama both are getting into business that is not theirs. That's where I think we have to try to go. Get them out of our business and just take care of international stuff and the running of the federal government without messing around with us. That would be my sense. But maybe I've been living in Alabama too long. Jeff is calling in. Jeff, where are you from?
Virginia.
See, and he'd probably go along with me. So what's your question today, Jeff?
Well, first of all, welcome back. You look great.
Thank you. I feel very good.
No more hamburger heaven for you.
Oh, you too, huh? Oh, man. I know. I haven't really been that tempted to go back.
Okay. I just had a quick question. Pope Francis is looking into ordaining female deacons. I would like to know what you thought about that.
Okay. First of all, he's not. Okay. See, and Jeff, I'm going to urge you and everyone else to be very careful about what you hear from the press. I was watching CNN about this, and what they reported, and then listening to the actual words of the Pope were two different things. What he said is that we're going to set up a commission to study this. That's very different. And it's something that should be studied. It's something I myself have studied and looked at. And I notice that, yes, in the early church, they did speak of the deaconesses in the church. You can see this. As a matter of fact, go to EWTN.com and go to our documents library and look up the Apostolic Constitutions. This is a liturgy book from right around 200 AD. more or less a few years. And they mention the deaconesses, and they make very specific. They are not ordained. They are appointed. And when you look at that in a couple other texts, you begin to see that what they meant by the deaconesses are what we later on called nuns. That's what that became. But see, that needs to be studied in more detail than I've done. I think some of those original texts are in Syriac, but there's a Latin translation, maybe a Greek translation. I have to take a look at all the vocabulary, understand it very carefully, and see some of the other things going on. And that study is a good thing to do. But I also am well aware that it's one of the goals of this Pope, as it was of Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul, is the greater integration of women into the church and into various feedback of how decisions are made, and that their perspective is so much needed. It's one of the great losses of so many nuns. We need the sisters and their perspective. They're extremely important. Does that mean we ordain women? That's going to be something else, because ordaining women to the diaconate would be ordaining them to a major order. The major orders are diaconate, priesthood, and episcopacy or bishop. And that was something that was explicitly rejected in the early church. And we can go into that someday more in details, but the issue is this, that maleness is the sign of Christ, the high priest. Femininity or femaleness is a sign of the church, his bride. That doesn't take away the dignity of women, because in reality, only one member of the church is perfect, and it's none of the popes. It's a woman, the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so, in terms of dignity, she has the highest dignity. In terms of office, Peter had the office of the rock and the papacy. And as anybody who has served in the military or the police or other organizations knows, having the uniform means that you salute. If the general walks in the room, you salute him. But that doesn't mean that the general's not a fool. If he has a bunch of stars on his shoulders, he could still be an idiot. But you still salute. Am I not correct, gentlemen? Yes. Ladies who've been in, and that's the way it is. So, Our Lady saluted St. Peter despite some of the things he did. All right, and Jeff, by the way, just to get Jeff Caven's Bible study program, it's called Our Father's Plan, and it's item number HDOFP. HDOFP. Okay? All right, we have another question from our studio audience. Sir, where are you from?
I am from...
Well, hold that up to your mouth there.
Oh, yeah, there we go. From southern Indiana.
Great, good to have you here. And your question?
I have a question regarding some of the moral issues of how to solve male what's it called? Transgender, thank you.
And female transgender.
And female transgender. Mm-hmm. That would, for instance, end up with a male transgender person in a female bathroom. Could be even an age difference in there. Could be an adult transgender person and a little girl in the bathroom. We know that sounds very undesirable to us, but what would be the solution for those transgender people and other such situations?
There are a couple things to keep in mind, because one, we're dealing also with folks in the government and media who are trying to change to get hold of the discussion by how they form the questions. And what their usual answer is, there is not a single case of somebody who is transgender trying to abuse anybody in a bathroom or such places. Okay? And I take them for their word for that. That's not the issue. The issue is when you're, if they've changed, if they've gone through the sex change, then of course they would go to the appropriate place. But the question is this, and this is a lawsuit that's going on now up one of the far northwestern states, Idaho or Washington, where it's a child who is transitioning, has not had any surgery because the child is too young, and insists, I think it's a boy, who insists that they gave him a bathroom and a shower for him to use, so he wouldn't be harassed by the other boys. But he said, no, I insist on being with the girls' shower and bathroom and locker room, even though he's not made the physical change. This is where there is and you see these folks who talk about with abortion, well, there's a right to privacy, except if you're girls showering and a boy who's transitioning thinks he wants to, do not those girls have a right to privacy in the restroom and the shower? Kids tend to be shy about this to begin with. This is not something, girls more than boys, but boys too, they tend to be shy. This is not what say, oh boy, I can hardly wait. No. They're uncomfortable, especially at 13, 14, 15. That's an age of transition for them anyway, just in terms of maturing. And to have people, or to have a girl who's transitioning, and I know of a case of that going on now, hasn't gone to the courts yet, but insists on being in the boys' shower and locker room. Now, this is not something that is going to be the right experience for any of them in terms of their privacy and modesty. And that's one of the questions. Protection of any child from bullying is a very high priority. And we have to let people know, we will not tolerate bullying by anyone of anyone else. You try it, this is going to be the consequence. And you have to let the kids know and then do it. Don't just threaten them. Give them the consequence for any bullying of any kind. It's not tolerated. But that doesn't mean, therefore, you let them go to the opposite gender and insult assault their sense of modesty. That is a higher priority. And if the courts can't see that it's a reasonable solution to let them go to a shower and restroom that is not specified for groups, that's an individual, that's what they think they need to do. If a court can't see that, then I'd like to see the members of that court go into the shower of the no, actually take that back. I don't want to see that. No, scratch. That's a dumb solution. I was thinking of, if it's good sauce for the goose, it's sauce for the gander. But no, that's stupid. But you can see that's why it's dumb. You wouldn't do it to the justices and the judges. You shouldn't do it to young people. And, again, what is it? Target people just are now uncomfortable going to their stores. They don't want to be in a situation where they could have that kind of circumstance arise in the changing room, etc. So that's it. All right. I've run out of time. May the Lord bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And again, remember, this network is brought to you by you. So please keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, and we'll be able to pay all of our bills too. Thank you, and God bless.